Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, just go to patreon.com/the History Network. We would really love you to become one of our patrons. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 33, episode 2, The Battle of Alcazar. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on here and the Ancient Warfare podcast. By mid-afternoon on the 4th of August 1578, 3 monarchs lay dead on the battlefield of Alcazar in Morocco, 2 sultans and King Sebastian I of Portugal. The consequences of their deaths would resonate for decades throughout Europe and North Africa. The Battle of Alcazar is known by several names, all of which are attempts at Anglicizing the town of El-Ksar, el-Kebir in Morocco, where the battle was fought. It is also known, unsurprisingly, as the Battle of the Three Kings. King Sebastian I of Portugal was supporting the deposed Moroccan Sultan Moulay Mohammed, Abu Abdullah Muhammad II, who had been ousted by his uncle Abd al-Malik. Abd al-Malik was the son of the founder of the Saadi dynasty in Morocco in 1544, Mohammed Sheikh, but had fled to the Ottoman Empire with his younger brothers in 1557, when their eldest brother, Abdullah al-Ghalib, became sultan and sought to eliminate the other members of his family who he saw as a potential threat to his power. Abd al-Malik was named successor in their father's will, but on Abdullah al-Ghalib's death from asthma in 1574, his son Moulay Mohammed took the title of sultan. This plunged the country into 4 years of civil war. Abd al-Malik invaded with an Ottoman army to support him in 1576, and Moulay Mohammed fled the capital, Marrakesh, to wage a guerrilla war against his uncle, eventually appealing for support to Sebastian in Portugal to invade Morocco and restore him to the throne. This was 16th century Christian-Muslim power politics at play. Sebastian, a dashing 24-year-old childless king with outmoded visions of chivalric kingship and feudal warfare, decided to help Moulay Mohammed by raising an army 17,000 strong and invading Morocco. Sebastian would lead the expedition personally, despite having no experience of warfare or command. He wanted to restore the glory of Portuguese feats of arms. The battle was the subject of several paintings, ballads, and works of literature, and at least 2 plays, most of which were English. The reason for the battle's notoriety in England especially was the presence in Sebastian's army of an English soldier of fortune, Thomas Stukely, born circa 1520. Stukely was rumoured to be a bastard son of Henry VIII and had been involved in all sorts of foreign escapades, both for and against the English crown, since the reign of Edward VI, 1547 to 53. Stukely had been a spy, pirate, mercenary, counterfeiter and all-round scoundrel since the early 1550s, yet he had escaped harsh punishment for these shenanigans, whilst his confederates often met with execution. Stukely's repeated escape from harm has led to the suspicion that he may have had a claim on the English throne. He said as much himself. He continued to be a thorn in the side of Elizabeth I and eventually fled to the continent in 1570. There he became a champion of the Catholic cause for an invasion of Ireland sponsored by the Spanish King Philip II and the Pope Pius V and then Gregory VIII. Stukely was deeply involved in various schemes for Spanish-led invasions of England and Ireland throughout Europe. He also commanded galleys at the Battle of Lepanto in October 1571. Stukely joined King Sebastian's expedition with a force of up to 800 Italians and Irish soldiers who had been paid for and provisioned by Pope Gregory for the long-planned invasion of Ireland. Stukely's presence at the battle was recorded in two plays: George Peele's The Battle of Alcazar, performed circa 1588, and the anonymous The Famous History of the Life and Death of Captain Thomas Stukely, circa 1600. These plays, both coming later in the century, reveal that Stukely's involvement was notorious at the time and continued to evoke interest into the 17th century. There were also ballads and other accounts of the battle in circulation in England. Stukely's decision to side with Sebastian seems in keeping with his pragmatism of looking out for himself. If it was, in fact, in order to gain additional Catholic support for the subsequent Irish invasion, we will never know. The papal consul general attempted to stop Stukely from landing at Lisbon in order to keep him to his original task, and he promised to deliver the additional funds requested by Stukely. Unfortunately, the ship Stukely had been provided with, the San Giovanni di Battiste, was in so poor a state of repair that Stukely had to dock. From Lisbon, Stukely was recruited into Sebastian's army. The Pope was amazed at the Portuguese king's actions in diverting Stukely from his divine purpose of restoring Ireland to the Catholic fold. Yet Sebastian's expedition also had papal approval, with both the papal nuncio and papal legate in its ranks. It had been Philip II of Spain who had encouraged Stukely to join with Sebastian, and he may have been playing games of his own. When Stukely had been given the ship with provisions and money to recruit up to 3,000 troops, he had been instructed to use them to do all the mischief that they may to that wicked woman. Unfortunately, the provisions were not enough for 600 men, let alone 3,000, and the ship could never have made it to Ireland. The Irish members of Stukely's expedition abandoned him in disgust after his decision to join Sebastian. They returned to Rome to protest Stukely's desertion from their cause of restoring Catholicism in Ireland, with most of the men and money intended for the invasion. Once Stukely had agreed to become a subordinate in Sebastian's army, however, his authority over his remaining men also disintegrated. One report back to the Pope spoke of Stukely's inability and the obvious distrust between him and his troops. We know that Stukely had been militarily active since the mid-1540s and had held various senior commands. It is possible that his lack of religious fervour and his willingness to be diverted from his papal purpose put his Italians completely offside, since it is unlikely that Stukely could have had the extensive military career he had had to that point if he was always mistrusted by his men. He would have found it difficult to impress his successive commanders, which he did do, if his men had always undermined him. Stukely joined Sebastian's 17,000-strong army, which was made up of 2,000 cavalry and about 4,500 peasant levies, 5,500 foreign troops, German, Walloon, Spanish, mainly Castilians, and Stukely's Italians, and 2,500 Portuguese gentlemen volunteers who paid their own way. The army was, therefore, largely untrained, and it lacked any kind of cohesion. We are told of other English gentlemen in the army by the English travel writer Richard Hakluyt, and Stukely always seems to have had English and Irish co-conspirators with him, intended for the invasion of Ireland at any rate, if not with him more generally for profit and adventure. Hakluyt names only a single Englishman, however, one M. Christopher Lister, who was taken prisoner but later escaped, returning to England in 1586. The Portuguese levies, who relied on the outdated pike, and gentlemen volunteers were gathered under feudal obligations, a practice sorely out of date in the late 16th century. Sebastian, although inexperienced at command, had old-fashioned knightly ideals of leading from the front and excelling his men in valour. Unfortunately, his lack of experience and headstrong unwillingness to listen to advice would lead very quickly to utter disaster. A fleet of 400 ships departed Lisbon in late June 1578 and landed at Azila on the Atlantic coast of Morocco on July the 14th and made camp. Signs of the unprepared and amateur nature of the Portuguese force were immediately apparent. The Portuguese made no fortifications despite being in hostile territory, and instead bivouacked in the open with no one knowing what their role was. As such, the mostly inexperienced men were prone to panic at the slightest disturbance. Abd-el-Malik offered to negotiate a peace, but this was rejected by Sebastian. The king then abandoned the agreed plan to march down the coast with the fleet in support, and decided instead to march inland in order to obtain a rapid and decisive victory. Sebastian would endure no advice to the contrary of this plan. Inhospitable terrain supplied problems to opposing armies abandoning the fleet, and was determined to bring the enemy to a decisive battle. Stukely objected to the plan to march immediately against a superior force of Moors, but he was shut down in injurious terms. The army headed off from camp on July 29th, accompanied by the baggage train and 9,000 camp followers, which included churchmen, pages, servants, slaves, and serving women. 1,100 wagons carried the noble baggage alone, and they themselves travelled in gilded carriages. It was a procession rather than an invasion, and heedless of their collective inexperience, the Portuguese expected a quick and swift victory. The baggage included such military essentials as musicians, pavilions, sumptuous furniture and vestments, and silver plate to eat off. Such processions had been commonplace on campaigns in the 15th and early 16th centuries, but war had become a much more serious and professional business by the 1570s. Despite the extensive baggage train, the Portuguese were short of both water and food from the outset of the march. They were harassed by Moroccan light cavalry, while the enemy awaited them at El-Ksar, el-Kebir. It took the Portuguese 6 days to march those 40 miles. A war council was held on the night of the 3rd of August, and there even Muley Mohammed, whose troops had reinforced Sebastian's numbers with an additional 6,000 men, advised Sebastian to wait and delay his attack until late the following day. His spies had informed him that Abd-el-Malik was sick, perhaps poisoned, and might not live out the day. If Abd-el-Malik died, it would throw the enemy into confusion, and victory would be an easy thing. Captain Stukely, as he now was, supported this advice, but was again silenced by the king, all but accused of cowardice by Sebastian. The king refused all counsel and chose instead to attack at first light. The king also selected the Portuguese position because it offered the opportunity for beautiful cavalry charges and high feats of arms. Opposing Sebastian's 23,000 men was the army of Abd-el-Malik, numbering between 50,000 and 70,000 troops. Sebastian's last mistake was to attack with his baggage train attached to the army in a large open square formation. Thus many of Sebastian's troops were squandered protecting silver plate and gilded carriages. Stukely and his Italians, along with the Spanish, were on the left wing, the Germans and Walloons on the right, and the centre was made up of the peasant levies. It is possible that, not trusting in their loyalties, Stukely split his Italians into detachments and inserted them between the Spanish contingents. The cavalry, led by Sebastian on the left and Muley Mohammed on the right, protected the flanks of the square. As Sebastian wished, the Battle of Alcazar began at first light on 4th of August 1578. It lasted 6 hours and was a Portuguese fiasco almost from start to finish. After initial manoeuvres, the Portuguese cavalry, with King Sebastian at their head, charged straight at the enemy centre and were at first successful, but they lacked the resources and reserves to take advantage of their gains. That was the only Portuguese success of the day. The Portuguese also lacked firearms, and as Moorish reserves filled the gaps in their line, their own cavalry chased the Portuguese cavalry back to their lines and then surrounded the square. The Portuguese army then disintegrated and was cut down. Losses were estimated at 8,000 dead and over 14,000 captured, destined for slavery or ransom. The number of survivors who made it back to the fleet at Arcilla numbered in the mere hundreds, much diminished from the 23,000 who had started out. Among the dead lay the childless King Sebastian, the ousted Muley Mohammed, the usurper Sultan Abd-el-Malik, who was indeed ill and did not live out the day, and Captain Thomas Stukely. Two traditions exist regarding Stukely's death. One was that he was killed early in the fighting when a cannonball took off his legs. The other tradition is that he was murdered by his own Italian soldiers after the imminent defeat of the Portuguese became obvious, both plays which have come down to us dramatise this version. At first glance, Stukely's death does not seem to have any real significance. After all, 3 kings were dead on the field, along with 40 dukes and earls, according to Richard Johnson's ballad from 1612. Perhaps the greatest consequence of the battle was that the Portuguese throne, left without an heir, would fall to Philip II of Spain within 2 years and remain a Spanish puppet until 1640. In addition, Sebastian had emptied the Portuguese coffers to embark on the campaign and left the country naked of nobility, as one contemporary historian put it. It was Stukely's death, however, which found and continued to find resonance in England. Stukely's death was seized upon by playwrights for the next 30 years at least, and he could still be referred to as a kind of bogeyman for Queen Elizabeth several years later. Things may be even more complicated. The events of Stukely's flamboyant life had always been immediately current in English society, and he was often mentioned in contemporary poetry and ballads. Stukely's being diverted to the Moroccan invasion by Sebastian or Philip seems at first glance a side project, and yet one totally in keeping with Stukely's pragmatic and expedient career of changing loyalties when it suited him. Yet the Moroccan adventure may have had more significance. Emily Bartels has written of the importance of Barbary and of trade with Morocco, especially in sugar, but also saltpetre, an essential ingredient for gunpowder. A trade mission to Morocco from England in 1577 secured just that commodity. English merchants, agents and other representatives were present in Morocco at the time of the Battle of Alcazar, and Stukely's progress with the Portuguese was reported back to Whitehall. His presence could only have undermined English interests and activities in Barbary. We have several accounts from merchants in Italy and Portugal reporting Stukely's doings back to William Cecil, Queen Elizabeth's spymaster. Cecil and Stukely had encountered each other early in Stukely's career, and early in Cecil's for that matter, and the adventurer seems to have bested Cecil on that occasion. Cecil never forgot the slight. English trade with Morocco sought to thwart Spain by trading both ammunition and arms for sugar. A papal ban on providing weapons to the infidel was ignored by England, whose queen had been excommunicated since 1570. Queen Elizabeth had been in negotiations with both Muley Mohammed and Abd-el-Malik, and after Alcazar she would negotiate with Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, Abd-el-Malik's brother, who took the throne and remained Sultan of the Saadi dynasty until 1603. These negotiations were very often secret, and state papers only allude to them, although there are traces of cover-up trade deals involving arms and ammunition. Contact between the two countries slowed following the Battle of Alcazar. but by the probable year of production of Peele's play in 1588, Ahmed al-Mansur had sent ambassadors to England to establish once again an economic and political alliance. Thomas Stukely's interference in Morocco, therefore, may have been a much larger problem for England, and one that explains why it would cause such concern and notoriety, and the involvement of a prominent personality like Stukely's jeopardised a delicate relationship. He had been instructed by the Pope to do mischief to Elizabeth, and perhaps he was doing just that. The ongoing necessity and importance of the relationship between England and Morocco may go some way to explain why Stukely remained a figure featured in English drama to the end of the 16th and into the 17th century. To be reminded of his interference and just how problematic a thorn in the side he had been to Elizabeth and England added to the contemporary relevance of the plays. Given that it had been Philip II who encouraged Stukely to join with Sebastian, we might see the King of Spain using Stukely as a pawn in his own games without telling the Englishman what his purpose was. This is a recurring theme throughout Stukely's career. He considered that he was an important and integral cog at the highest levels of European government, but he was always regarded by monarchs and their ministers as a pawn to be sacrificed for whatever scheme they saw fit to employ him in. And he had been in the employ of not only English monarchs and Philip II, but also King Henri II of France, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, two popes, as well as Mary of Hungary, John of Austria, and the Duke of Savoy. And even though he had firmly entwined himself with the Catholic cause at the end of his life, a commitment he went to great lengths to prove, he seems to have shown no qualms in being a Protestant partisan earlier in his career when it suited him. He is the epitome of the ambitious, upwardly mobile, pragmatic adventurer. The Battle of Alcazar reveals fascinating insights on several levels. It lays bare the intricacies of Christian European intervention in Muslim politics in the 16th century, as well as the use of Barbary for power struggles on the continent. It highlights the dangers of inexperienced commanders rejecting the advice of experienced men, and in Thomas Stukely we can glimpse the remarkable career of a mercenary captain, adventurer, and schemer of the First Order. Well, thank you once again, Murray, for writing another script for us. And if you would like to write a script for us, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your ideas of what you would like us to cover in a podcast, and to have your script to do that. You can drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, for all of that. And again, please do go along to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork and become a patron of the podcast. We appreciate all of our patrons so much. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.